Family and fellow soldiers, I'm the professor, and this is the moment of truth.
But let me take it a step further, please, if I may. This is called normalization.
Yes.
This is the descent into fascism, if we so choose. Normalizing January 6th, it's a day of love. It's a day of love. I'll say it again and again and again. Normalizing enemy from within. I'll say it again and again. I'll say it again and again until you get tired of it, until it's not so funny anymore, or you think he doesn't mean it until you realize he does mean it and it's too late.
3 weeks later.
So Joe Scarborough and Mika Brzezinski have spent a long time warning about you-know-who poses a dangerous threat to the future of democracy. So this morning they surprised a lot of viewers when they talked about how they spent the weekend. Take a look.
Joe and I went to Mar-a-Lago to meet personally with President-elect Trump. It was the first time we have seen him in 7 years.
Now, we talked about a lot of issues, including abortion, mass deportation, threats of political retribution against political opponents, and media outlets. We talked about that a good bit. And it's going to come as no surprise to anybody who watches this show, has watched it over the past year or over the past decade, that we didn't see eye to eye on a lot of issues, and we told him so.
What we did agree on was to restart communications. For nearly 80 million Americans, election denialism, public trials, and January 6th were not as important as the issues that moved them to send Donald Trump back to the White House with their vote. Joe and I realize it's time to do something different, and that starts with not only talking about Donald Trump, but also talking with him.
So I actually think it was the right thing to do, and I've heard a lot of folks on the left coming after Joe and Mika saying, don't normalize.
Apparently, this Farrah woman who used to work for Trump, by the way, she must have been drunk, high, or in a coma when Mika was on the show and saying that this was normalization.
This is called normalization.
Yes.
This is the descent into fascism, if we so choose. Normalizing January 6th, it's a day of love. It's a day of love. I'll say it again and again and again. Normalizing enemy from within. I'll say it again and again. I'll say it again and again.
And I talked to Mika, actually. They met with him for over 90 minutes. They raised very valid concerns. They both see themselves as opinion journalists who want to actually be able to engage the person that they talk about every day, actually be able to raise issues with them when they're concerned.
You know, when the white media claimed that Trump would be the next Hitler, they were being led by MSNBC. The white media made it clear that he would be a fascist dictator should he ever seize the White House again, and anyone dealing with him was simply enabling a dictator in waiting. This was what they did throughout the 4 years Trump was in the White House, and even after he had been briefly voted out. I remember how Trump ridiculed Mika Brzezinski for her facelift back after he became president. Trump ridiculed her, saying that her facelift was a horrible job and that he could see the blood from the incision marks the surgeon had made. He took some real low blows at Mika and Joe. Well, don't look now, but Joe Scarborough and Mika Brzezinski both went to meet with the Orange Man at Mar-a-Lago. Well, does this mean the Orange Man isn't an irrational dictator in waiting anymore? Not since Nixon visited China did a surprise meeting like this startle so many people. The brains behind this little stunt must have been Joe Scarborough. Yeah, Mika Brzezinski's father was the infamous Zbigniew Brzezinski, but Mika, she's basically a wannabe social climber. Joe Scarborough, on the other hand, he was a Republican congressman, you'll recall, back in the 90s, and a racist pustule. He's trying to position himself because that's what opportunists do, is he sees that the fact that he was a Republican gives him entree, and after all, if the guy's going to have to be dealing with Trump, you might as well go ahead and get in good with him. They had to bring the Cold War to an end sooner or later. But I'd remind people that when Tamir Rice was murdered, Joe Scarborough and Mika Brzezinski were taking the side of the police on their little show and claiming that Tamir Rice had removed the orange tip of the toy gun that he had been playing with. And Scarborough stuck by that claim boldly. That is, until the video came out showing that the police never even saw the toy gun before they murdered that child. I add that because every time I see Joe Scarborough or Mika Brzezinski, that's what comes to my mind. The way that those two tried to justify the murder of a black child. This is who the people are who are calling Trump some sort of bad person. They ought to know they're no better than he is. But it puts the lie to the last 8 years that these same people on MSNBC have been saying that they're absolutely convinced that Trump is doing the same thing Hitler did, and that anyone who tries to make nice with him is making nice with someone who's going to become an American dictator. Okay, now that Scarborough and Mika, the bigot Brzezinski, have been making nice with the gonna-be dictator, will their co-workers and colleagues at MSNBC hold them to account? Will anybody at MSNBC call them out? Will anyone resign in protest? Or will we see a number of them trying to quietly follow suit? My money is on Ari Melber giving some mealy-mouthed speech about how getting closer to the Orange Man is the only way to keep a close eye on him, and then immediately announcing that he's got an interview with Trump. But the reality is, as we saw during Trump's first term, these very same media companies who are criticizing him, they desperately want to be in good with his FCC and to get favorable treatment from the government. Because Trump has shown, if nothing else, he wants to deregulate a lot of things, which is exactly what these white media companies' parent companies want. So changing their stance on Trump is in their corporate interest, same way that making him their foil for 8 years was also in their interest because it took their ratings sky high. As Mo Lester Moonves, the disgraced former head of CBS, said, "It may not be good for America, but it's damn good for CBS." He also went on to say the money's rolling in, and this is fun. I've never seen anything like this, and this is going to be a very good year for us. Sorry, it's a terrible thing to say, but bring it on, Donald. Keep going. Keep in mind, when it comes to presidential campaigns, all of that $500 million that you see Trump getting and the $1 billion Kamala Harris got, that stuff largely goes to these white media corporations, particularly broadcast companies like CBS. That's what Moonves meant by it's good for CBS. Yeah, it's good for their bottom line. It makes politics exciting. It makes it where all of these corporations have an opportunity to say, look at the latest crazy thing Donald Trump says and look at the response from the Democrats. Yeah, it makes it really entertaining and really profitable. So while the people on these very same networks were in front of their cameras telling you that the nation was teetering on the brink of a dystopian future, the heads of these corporations were celebrating because business has never been better. A lot of people, too many in fact, have compared American politics to professional wrestling. And these comparisons have become turbocharged with the Orange Man because he actually was on pro wrestling for a while. But the white media understands how politics is more like wrestling than not, and the white media is taking a page from pro wrestling's playbook by deciding that they have to take on Trump. The white media did the same thing Vince McMahon did after the steroid trial and made themselves into part of the show. All of these network people were suddenly competing to see who could be the most anti-Trump, who could be the most apocalyptic with their language. Why? Ordinarily, we have to remain cool, calm, and detached, but because of the unique threat that Donald Trump and his toupee represent, we have to speak. We simply have to at this moment. And they could get away with it because most of the GOP politicians were still pretending to be more or less dignified than Trump, who was always showing how unrefined he was. So the white media got to pretend that the country was and is facing an existential crisis, while at the same time still maintaining the same old courtesies and camaraderie with Republican politicians who they still brought on their shows. Business as habitual. But by making themselves part of the show, they also magnified their own profiles. Rachel Maddow was making about $7 million a year before Trump decided to run for office. But the year that Trump was inaugurated, Forbes was calling Rachel Maddow the most powerful person in cable news. As the highest profile person on the so-called left-leaning broadcast media, she became the face of the so-called resistance to Trump, with her biggest moment being the utter fool she made of herself when she spent hours hyping that she had gotten her hands on Trump's tax returns, only to reveal that all she had was a measly one-page summary. That moment got her a lot of ridicule, but it also got her a lot of viewer eyeballs, too. The Trump years were so good to Rachel Maddow that after Trump left office, MSNBC was so desperate to keep Rachel on that they paid her $30 million a year even though she no longer worked on her own show. She got paid more money than she ever had to do less work than she'd ever done. The obvious fear from MSNBC was that their golden girl might get wooed away by CNN, and they were right. Jeff Zucker had been trying to get Rachel Maddow to come over to CNN with a $20 million offer to join CNN's damn-to-fail attempt at starting a streaming service. So you see how the games are being played at all levels of the white media. Trump was simply grist for the mill, fuel for their machine. Now, while I'm sure that some of the disdain and contempt that these cable anchors show for Trump is somewhat genuine, I'm more sure that it's mostly an act. We've seen more anchors break down into phony tears over Trump and the border camps for illegals, or calling countries in Africa S-hole countries. These network anchors, particularly the female ones, apparently they had some sort of informal contest going to see who could put the most extras on their performance. And the Emmy for most distraught on-air breakdown goes to... And for all these media theatrics, they got their networks lots of attention. Every time you had somebody like Allison Camerata or whomever else, Rachel Maddow crying about kids on the border, they always got tons of headlines, tons of clicks, tons of views. As Les Moonves said, Trump is good for business. But now the scenario's different. They have to deal with the fact that Trump is back, and their attempts to destroy him failed. Now the orange man's holding all the cards, so yes, some of them will have to crawl back on their bellies because, as Omar from The Wire said, you take a shot at the king, you best not miss. Well, these guys took thousands of shots at the king, and a few literal ones, and they all missed. If there's one thing that Trump likes, though, it's seeing people who opposed him groveling on their knees before him. But understand something. What Scarborough and Brzezinski are doing isn't going to be some one-off. There's going to be others from the left corner of the white media who's going to join them in due time. Now, most of them won't be so public about it, though some of them, depending on how low their ratings are, will probably make some sort of on-air announcement as well. But you better believe that there have already been some Trump detractors from the left corner of the white media who have already made a phone call or two to his staff or tried to arrange a meeting under the guise of it being for an interview. Interesting how quickly the resistance has turned into the collaborators. And since the white media is the propaganda arm of the same monster as the white government, you can bet there's Democrats doing the same thing. The people who in both the white media and the government have claimed that this was going to be the end of American democracy are now forced to put that rhetoric aside. These are the people who refuse to talk to the black community about anything, by the way. As they claim democracy hung by a thread with this election, and that this election would decide whether or not there would be American democracy, and yet with stakes so high, as they said, they still refuse to talk to us. Apparently, the only thing they feared more than Trump was talking to black voters. So, as I've told you, no matter what the people you see on TV may claim, clearly the situation was nowhere near as dire as they were trying to portray it, and even they didn't think it was that bad because they weren't acting like it. If this really was the last minute before Nazi America comes to pass, then they should have easily been able to make the decision to come to us. They should have been ringing our phones off the hooks, banging on our doors, sending representatives, but instead, they did none of that. They went out of their way to avoid talking to us, except to attack us. Now that they were willing to do. And now you see why. As with everything else, the white media lies through its teeth. So, for all you shills, plants, and simple-minded Negroes out there whose knees were knocking and who were peeing your pants because you just knew that the orange man was going to usher in an era of Nazism in America, and this is the beginning of the American totalitarian state. First of all, black people have been living under totalitarianism in America from day one. We have never had a day of democracy. We've never had a day of freedom in this country. So you sound stupid talking about Trump's going to take away a freedom that you've never experienced. And the white folks in the white media who you were listening to and mindlessly repeating whatever they were telling you, I hope you're not too heartbroken now that they've shown you where they really stood all along. The black media told you, but for some of you, you didn't quite believe it. But I'll bet you probably believe it now because you see some of these good white leftists doing it. And trust me, before it's all over, when these guys get confronted on their flip-flop on the orange man, the fact that they did a complete 180 with an individual who they claimed you cannot do a 180 with, before it's all over, they're going to be claiming that, well, the reason we did it was we were working so very hard behind the scenes, of course, to keep the orange man from toppling American democracy. You just don't know how hard we were working. Sure they were. It only looked like they were just conducting business as usual, right? This is not about whether you believe me. This is about whether you believe your own eyes and your own ears. The only people who this turnabout is going to come as a surprise to are people who don't listen to the black media. People who decide that what they see from the white media is more or less real or more or less genuine, when we spend all of our time telling you that not one syllable of it is, except when they're heaping scorn on black people. Now, that's about the only time that they are being honest. So this is how the second season of the Trump presidency is going to unfold, with the white media basically trying to find some way to tiptoe into the orange man's good graces. And a lot of these folks who have been railing against him, their rhetoric is going to become more and more soft until it eventually becomes muted altogether, Sure, there'll be a few hoots and hollers out there of people who are trying to keep the home fires burning, mostly for appearance's sake, because they spent so many years saying that Trump was going to be the second coming of the devil. But for the most part, you can see the corporate heads are already making it clear we need to tone down some of all that stuff. If the orange man's going to be in there, as long as his fiscal policies are going to be good for our bottom line, then maybe we need to go ahead and make nice with them on some level. Because CNN has basically been Fox News Light for several years now, and MSNBC has had bigger problems than just Joe Scarborough and Mika the bigot Brzezinski. Both of these two networks have not been on black people's side. So for them, going ahead and making themselves more palatable to the white right, that's been part of the program from day one. But what shouldn't be part of the program is black people believing any of this crap that these guys are saying. This is the final verdict on all of the hysterics that these guys were doing for the last 8 years. The black media told you that it was all just for show, that these people were just putting on a performance. And you have people who say, well, isn't it true on some level? Wouldn't they be putting their credibility on the line like this? Man, the biggest problem in America happens to be, as Dr. King put it, we are a 10-minute nation. People forget about things 10 minutes from now. That's what the white media banks on. That's how they get away with saying one thing one moment and then the exact opposite thing the next. For the most part, they don't have to worry about any credibility being lost because most people have already been conditioned to see the white media as basically politically oriented entertainment. That's the part of the brains that gets reached. Sure, what they're seeing in front of them is basically real as far as the death and carnage and violence goes, but it's more like a reality show. And for them, the only thing that would be going off script would be if they were forced to have to produce something for black people. So all of you folks out there who are thinking that these good white leftists you saw on television, that they were part of some sort of political resistance, now you see that it was just media theatrics. This is what it's always been. The entire goal from day one was to drive up their ratings, go ahead and use Trump as some sort of political foil, and play the game. And it's okay because this guy is so extreme and so far out there that even if this guy got back into the White House, well, you just tone down the rhetoric and you tell those rubes out there watching in TV land who were getting so worked up about the white media's phony hysterics, go ahead and tell them, well, we have to make peace at some point, and they'll go right along with it because they weren't smart enough to see through this paper-thin scam to begin with. What people keep forgetting is that Donald Trump's show The Apprentice was on NBC, which was a sister network to MSNBC. And that being the case, it would not at all surprise me if years from now, when Trump leaves the White House, either he or any of his little brats would wind up getting yet another reality show on NBC. Or, in the ultimate absurdity, if Donald Trump wound up getting himself a show or at least a panelist gig on MSNBC itself. As ridiculous as that prospect may sound, if it came to pass, it wouldn't surprise me one bit. After all, as the white media understands, and too many of their viewers don't, the white media is in the business of getting you to pay attention while they tell you lies, and to have you living your life as if the lies were true. That's the business that they're actually in. Mind control. And as Les Moonves explained, Donald Trump is good for business. Good day, and be one. I'd like to take a moment to mention some of our contributors. Cloudwalker Z, Angela Williams, Reginald Britt, Tyquin Campbell, and Gregory Franklin. Salute to them and thank you to everyone for listening, liking, and sharing this message. Black empowerment only exists because of you.